Welcome back. It's the second series of The Commute, the podcast which looks at some of the big ideas out there from a South African perspective. I'm the host, Jessica Van Onselen, and I've had a short break from the pod, but very glad to be back in the seat for 2019. We've got a great Series 2 shaping up, with some smart and fun guests, and maybe even a return from some of our more popular guests to give us updates on topics from Series 1. And if you have any ideas of any topics you would like covered on the podcast, please don't hesitate to let me know. I've had such nice messages about The Commute from listeners in South Africa, but also from the States and the UK and Australia and Kenya. So if you have anything you'd really like a bit of an explainer on, you can email me on thecommutesa@gmail.com. That's thecommutesa@gmail.com. So much has happened since September. What with the French riots, the American midterm elections, and now the government shutdown, this horrific terrorist attack in Nairobi, and the terrifying crackdown going on in Zim. But let's kick off Series 2 with my current favourite feel-good topic, Brexit. Now, I know you're surprised I chose the word feel-good, but let me explain this. If you're at all like me, dear listener, you are sometimes overwhelmed with feelings that you have no idea what you're doing, that you spend all your time on pointless and wasteful endeavours, that you frequently make mistakes and everyone notices them all the time, and that your friends and colleagues have got everything under control and are just doing great. And you're just one morning away from giving up under the weight of your own inadequacy and ability to get things right. But here's where the feel-good factor comes in. Even if every single one of those concerns were true, even if you email forward your salary slip to your friend with a cover note that says, WTAF, this place is ripping me off, and CC'd the entire company, you can draw comfort from the fact that it is not humanly possible for you to be more of a fuck-up than Brexit is. Britain's decision to leave the European Union was taken in 2016 via a referendum, in which most people, including the politicians advocating so hard for it, now admit they had pretty much zero idea what an exit in the modern world would actually involve. Slowly, however, certain painful truths have been emerging. This is in spite of some straight-up lying from the Tory government that would have put Cloudy Motsoeneng to shame. It's so breathtaking. Actually, there are several truths that Brexiters have not wanted to admit are unavoidable. Things like, it's nigh on impossible to solve the problem of the Irish border, that you can't actually redirect EU membership fees into Britain's underfunded National Health Service, that Britain will have to pay a so-called divorce bill, and that Britain still needs immigration to have enough workers to care for its ageing population. But if one was hosting a Tory lies competition, sort of like a Miss Universe pageant for Conservative Party fibs, my opinion is that the winning porker, the lie that would get the crown, the Priyanka Chopra of whoppers, would be the one that it would be easy for Britain to negotiate a new trade deal with the European Union once it was leaving. Liam Fox, the Minister for International Trade in the government, actually said on the 20th of July 2017 that the free trade agreement that we will have to do with the European Union should be one of the easiest in human history. Now, you know how I knew that was nonsense? Because I am South African, and I remember how long it took us to negotiate our trade deal with the European Union back in the late 90s, when everyone loved us and we were the Tiffany Haddish of the emerging economy world. You might too. Do you remember back in about 1998 when there were suddenly all these stories about the EU wanting to take away the name Rooibos and also telling South African winemakers they weren't allowed to call sparkling wines champagne anymore? They had to call it MCC or Method Cup Classique. Yeah, that was all part of the years-long trade negotiation between South Africa and the EU, which was finally signed in 1999 and came into effect in 2000. It took years to negotiate that one deal. And that was not considered an unreasonable time period. All in all, Brexit is excruciating to witness. To watch Britain, a bastion of stable government and responsible policy, be consumed by politics that are a rancid, smelly mix of untruths and fantasy and colonial nostalgia and resentment is painful, and it's really difficult to understand. Why would a mature democracy do this to itself? What led to it? And also from a South African perspective, what does it mean? What if Britain's own goal presents opportunities for South Africa in terms of trade, tourism, and skilled migration? If Britain insists on shooting itself in the foot, can South Africa send in a doctor and bandages? As I record this, it's the middle of January and I'm sitting in the UK and Theresa May's deal was voted down by Parliament. And Parliament is indicating it will not allow no deal because it would seriously harm the UK economy. And the Brexiteers aren't able to present a deal that they would find acceptable. All in all, I believe the technical military term is F.U.B.A.R. If you don't know what F.U.B.A.R is, I'd recommend you look it up. To talk about the Brexit mess, I knew only one South African as obsessed with it as I was, Lukanyo Mnyanda. Many of you might know Lukanyo as the editor of Business Day, but he's also a keen follower of UK politics, having lived and worked in the UK and specifically in Scotland for many, many, many years. I got Lukanyo on the line as I stared at the UK rain, and he had just returned from President Ramaphosa's pre-Davos press conference. Welcome to the Commute Series 2. So pleased to have you here.
Thank you, Jessica. Thanks for having me here, and thanks to the wonders of technology that I'm talking to you here from Joburg.
Yes. Is it boiling hot in Joburg today?
It's maybe not as yesterday. Yesterday it was 34 degrees in my car when I was driving, and I had to wear a suit.
Oh, God. All right. Okay. So hopefully today is a little bit cooler. So we're actually talking the day after the historic Brexit vote. Theresa May's deal was defeated in the British Parliament. Some people are saying it was the biggest defeat in democratic history in Britain. Some are saying since the 1920s. But in any event, 202 votes for the deal, 432 votes against the deal. An absolutely thumping defeat and rejection from both Brexiteers and Remainers for Theresa May's deal. You and I are here to talk a little bit about what Brexit might or might not mean for South Africa. But let's start at the beginning. What is Brexit? How did we get to Brexit? Why did the UK want to leave the European Union?
Jessica, I suppose the question but where do you start, really? Because, I mean, the UK has already had a fraught relationship with the EU. Even from the beginning, when it joined, it was a late joiner, like in the mid-70s, about 1973 or so. Well, even though it went on a huge majority at a time when Britain was what they used to say about Germany, the sick man of Europe, where he was in a bit of economic troubles, and so joining the EU was sort of maybe seen as a way to integrate better and promote trade. But then Britain was never really there's a sense it was never really a fully committed member like Germany or France was. So this has always been an issue of political conflict within the UK, within the Tory party especially. So it's a long running thing, and then obviously over the years it got hijacked with issues around immigration. That sort of seemed to have become the issue that really drove it in this period of the 90s, 2000s, when the UK economy was powering ahead, and you had a lot of immigration, especially from Eastern Europe. And I think a lot of the anti-Brexit people sort of fed into that sentiment. Being part of the EU obviously means open borders, means free movement, and that sort of became hijacked into that, and that sort of gave it this popular ring to it, which eventually led to the vote that we had, and then also still linked to the internal party politics in the Tory party, because you remember that we got here because David Cameron, before the previous election, offered that if the Tories got a majority, he would get this referendum on. But he made that promise on the assumption that he would actually lose because he had been in coalition with the Lib Dems at that point. So thinking he was going to be in another coalition, in which case then he could have said, "Oh, sorry, I would have loved to have had this referendum, but no, I'm in coalition with the Lib Dems, so they won't let me do it." And Lord behold, he won his majority, and then that's why we're here, basically.
So you're saying there that a long history of Euroscepticism going back to the 70s, the Tory party has never really been entirely sure if it wants to be in or out. And I suppose some of that can in fact be traced back to almost World War II and a bit of skepticism about joining up with previous enemies, in an economic union. Mm-hmm. So that does go back a really long time. Now, to me as an outsider, if I look at the European Union, first of all, it's offered peace. I mean, there hasn't been war since the European Union. Second of all, it seems to offer great economic advantages. I wish Africa would get more into an economic union. And thirdly, it seems to have this really civilized immigration policy. So why are the Eurosceptics so skeptical of Europe? What's not to like?
With the EU and Britain, what I found quite strange is one of the few things that really unite the left and the right, or the extremes on those sides. I mean, the people on the right, they've always hated the EU because they think it's too much regulation. They don't like the environmental regulations. They don't like regulations on labor, and they would like to have a free-for-all, free markets. They don't like the welfare state.
So these are sort of arch capitalists. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. That's a strange thing about the EU. It can be everything to everybody. On the left, then you got people Corbyn was one of those from the 70s, who see the EU as some kind of tool of capital, as some kind of capital or capitalist project, that the free market is a way to take away sovereignty from states, take away workers' rights, and do all these things. People believe both those extreme positions about the same organization. It's actually quite fascinating.
So it's both a tool of capitalism and a socialist project that's going to destroy Capitalism. All right, well, that's very convenient. Sounds like all things to all people, as you say. So David Cameron called this fateful referendum. A lot of people were shocked that there was the result was leave. There appears to have been Russian meddling. We know that Aaron Banks, who was one of the main funders of leave, has now been referred to the National Crime Agency in Britain for illegal activity. So those criminal investigations are ongoing for the role in leave. But I'm quite interested in those structural forces you were talking about that led to Brexit. I think the European Union does seem like a bit of a bogeyman for a lot of people. But there was recently this UN report which was published in 2018, which spoke a little bit about the austerity policies that the Conservative Party introduced in the wake of the 2009 global financial crisis. Now, these were extreme cuts to the British budget. They swept through the whole of Britain. It's difficult to explain to South Africans listening to this quite how far the depth and breadth of austerity measures affected British society. But people talk about it almost as a trauma. Stories about local parks being falling into dilapidation, high streets going bankrupt, budgets being cut at local level, in an almost incomprehensible way. So the UN brought out this report in 2018, wondering if the effects of austerity might have impacted the Brexit vote. Do you think, having come off many years of living in the UK, there might be some truth to that argument?
That's quite an interesting question. Obviously, as you know, like George Osborne was a chancellor at the time, and at the moment he's like the editor of the Evening Standard, and he's totally obviously anti-Brexit. Whenever you mention that link, he violently denies it. But there's no denying that. I think you can take it a bit even further, the era of deindustrialization of large areas of the country, especially in the north of the country, being left deindustrialized and being left behind, and the perception that the policy was all towards London. Because London became the focal point of policy. London was a focal. Every story you heard about property market in London and everything like this, everything. People out there were already feeling left behind. And then you had this period of austerity from about 2010, when the Tory Lib Dem coalition came into force and basically started undoing a lot of the stuff that Labour they put in across. I was living in the UK at that time, and I remember for one thing, one of the first things that George Osborne did was to reverse that Gordon Brown policy, where every child born in the UK was entitled to some kind of ISA kind of thing to sort of encourage a culture of saving across the population. Just explain to
our listeners what an ISA is. So he wanted every child to have access to a nest egg.
Yeah, to an investment basically. It was not a big amount. It's just tax-free investment. It was about £200 per person or per child. What it would do, maybe it couldn't calculate a culture of saving in the sense that people have got a stake in the economy, and then people will top up those things over time. But it was quite symbolic thing that was one of the first things they went after. When you have a crisis and you think the first thing to do is to go after small children, they went to the really basics of everyday life, So if you are living on or you're getting state support or for social housing and you got basically a spare bedroom, they would just take some of your money, or else. Yeah, and then you had all these things. It's all about child benefit being restricted to I think 2 children now. So if you imagine if you're a single mother, you've got more than 2 children, then suddenly the third child gets
so all aspects of British life, you suddenly get this extreme austerity, and also you get these quite religious views coming from the top of the Tory party that this is a chance to quote unquote correct Britain. We're going to fix all these terrible policies that Labour brought in, but the harm on a personal level, as you say, for single moms, if you're living on a council housing estate, your spare bedroom, it really rocked the whole of Britain, austerity.
And also, obviously the cut in spending, an investment, a lot of you would assume a lot of industry that was more dependent on state funding would have been the areas outside of London, the places that were deprived already. Whereas a place like in London, with this amazing financial services sector was always going to be fine. So you've had this. So you've had this sense people feeling they're left behind, and also feeling they're unheard. And then suddenly, when this Brexit issue comes, and then is suddenly their chance to say, we're gonna show the elites there, like we're gonna reinforce, we're gonna, I don't know, try and have a voice. And basically, it's almost like give a finger to London, which is a big irony in a sense, because London was one of the big beneficiaries of Brexit, because with the big collapse in the pound, suddenly you had millions of tourists flooding into Britain. And I can tell you for sure, they were not going into Sunderland. They were going to London. It's one of those sad ironies. And the places that really wanted to use this vote to have a voice and to say we're tired of being dominated by London, and we're actually the ones who to suffer, and London is actually the one to benefit.
Yeah, London is almost insulated from the full extent of this stuff. Whether or not you're watching Brexit and you find it difficult to believe, or you think it's a great idea. It then opens up these questions of if Britain's going to change its trading relationship with the EU, and it's going to change its immigration policy. As a South African, or as South Africans, you and I are watching this and we're thinking, well, is there first of all economic opportunity for South Africa? We have great agriculture sector, highly skilled, we definitely want an export economy. And also, we can get separately into sort of immigration or freedom of movement issues with the Commonwealth. But let's start with the economy. So Theresa May pays what I like to think of a bit of a suck-up visit to Cyril Ramaphosa in August 2018. Total charm offensive. She came to South Africa. She was filmed dancing, to much mockery on social media. She made a bunch of promises. She said that the Brits were going to hand over the SS Mendy Bell, which is sort of a symbolic, I think, apology for, maybe overlooking the role of Black South Africans in the World Wars. She said she supported land reform, and then she praised Ramaphosa's economic plans. She really sort of got behind his plans to turn around the economy after the Zuma years. And then critically, they announced that they were going to have this deal of 800 million rand between Britain and Britain and South Africa, although the precise details of that deal we don't actually know that much about. So this sounds like fantastic news to me. I mean, is this going to be salad days for South Africa and Britain? Or is South Africa going to get rich off Brexit?
So that's quite a difficult one. My instinctive answer would be to say no, but maybe let's start from the beginning. I mean, there are a lot of different scenarios, obviously, where that big vote yesterday, as you mentioned, that Theresa May lost massively there. So we don't actually know what's going to happen. I suppose the scenarios they go from. Some people are saying actually the pound actually gained after that vote. So some people say this might mean there's actually no Brexit at all at some point. That the country at some point realized that Brexit is not really deliverable. So, but on the other hand, you could totally have a totally messy Brexit where Britain leaves the EU in about 2 months without a deal at all, and who knows what might come in between. So the consequences could be quite varied depending on what we get. I mean, one of the things from a South African perspective, whether we like it or not, we've got very deep historical relationships with Britain. I mean, I'm not going to give you a whole lecture about colonialism and everything else.
I do want to talk about colonialism, but finish your point, yeah.
But as we are now, Britain as it stands, the EU is still our biggest trading partner. And I think that within the EU, the UK is our second biggest trading partner after Germany. I mean, I saw a number somewhere. I think apparently that the Brits consume something like 40% of our wine exports.
Really?
So it's quite a huge market for us. And then obviously there's a broader thing as well, because this is when you look at Brexit, especially if there's a messy one, it's totally unprecedented. Nobody knows how it's going to work out because there's nothing to compare it to. It's almost if you go back 10 years with the collapse of Lehman Brothers, when nobody had an idea what was going to happen, and we know what happened afterwards. So what happens after a messy Brexit? Does the UK have a big recession? And as I said, if you look at our trading relationship, so a recession in the UK obviously will hurt us massively because Britain is our biggest trading partner, is also our biggest source of one of our biggest sources of investment, and also one of our biggest source of tourists. I mean, you go to Cape Town anytime December, you see how many English accents, how many British accents you hear there. So an economic slowdown in Britain is definitely going to be a terrible thing for us. And then also there's some that's also tend to be quite forgotten. Even though the people in Britain or maybe outside of London don't like to appreciate it, but the city of London is a very crucial global center for the sort of allocation of capital. So if Brexit then hurts London, and it hurts the ability of the financial services sector there to do what it always does, which is allocate capital and and we need capital. We need access to capitals. So there are all these kind of like consequences that could come into play. And then on the issue of trade, I know from Minister Davis, the minister here, that there are already discussions with the UK government about how we can smooth out the relationship, because basically South Africa's trade relationship is still with the UK is governed by the trade deal that was signed with the EU. So then the question is, what happens if the UK falls out of that? Do we then suddenly go back to massive quotas on our exports to Britain and those kind of things? So big implications. But I think like the Minister of Trade and Industry, Rob Davies, has said that they are already talking with their counterparts in the UK and trying to work out like things like that, tariffs and quotas and apparently there are some technical things they're talking about, but he's saying there are almost in the final stages of that. Obviously, they can't discuss a trade deal because the UK is actually not allowed to discuss a trade deal because it's still part of the EU, it's part of the customs union. But they are working to try and make sure that if the UK does fall out of the EU trade deal, that there's something that can replace it. But it's not an easy thing. I mean, like I think it's an issue that they're having with Switzerland, for example. They had a similar deal where they said they will try and maintain the relationship with a key proviso, I said, as far as is possible, to close to.
So, all right. So those conversations are underway, and that makes a lot of sense. And just to return to your original point about a long history with Britain, I mean, I think my impression reading the news and listening to a lot of the commentary from British politicians is that the historic relationship between Britain and its colonies, particularly under empire, it perhaps has informed some of the fantasies around Brexit, i.e., should Britain break with the EU, it would have these colonies, India, Australia, South Africa, Zimbabwe, feeding in at very low prices into the colonial centre, and the glory days of empire might be back. If we just talk in economic terms, not even in terms of psychological domination. But of course, those days have long gone. Australia is now, that market is totally embedded into Asia and China. South Africa has diversified, is with the EU. Zim is maybe not producing as much.
Yeah, exactly.
But all those former colonies, just from an economic point of view, are not going to go into that totally mothership, satellite ship relationship that existed 100 years ago. It's just not going to happen. No,
definitely not. I mean, the one thing that Brexit people don't seem to understand, because at the moment, the UK must take into account, hasn't actually had an independent trade policy since the 40s. So not for the 70s, sorry. I'm just saying about 40 years or more than 40 years rather than the 40s.
Since the 70s, all right.
Since the 70s, yeah. So so all the deals that it's got, they're all part of EU deals. And as far as what I saw last time, I think something like 60 trade deals which we'll have to renegotiate. So even if it does go and have these relationships, I mean, the Britain is going to be sort of the price taker, so you like. We know from our own trade deal with the EU how long it took to negotiate. So the idea that the UK can just negotiate like 60, 70 trade deals in no time is totally like a fantasy. So in this case, it means like, and everybody knows that. So it sort of gets to your question when you were saying earlier whether South Africa could gain from this. I think a lot of these countries will be looking at that, thinking, Britain is desperate. It wants to do these trade deals. It needs to do so many of them in such a short period of time. So everybody is just going to try and get as much as they can out of it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think when the whole vote first came out, I remember reading something when I was still living in the UK about how the UK actually did not have any trade negotiators, so it was actually going to have to import them.
Yes.
So and then from places like India and South Africa and stuff. So
Canada,
you could have this scenario,
in
Canada, whatever. So you could have this scenario where there's a trade negotiation between India and Britain, and all the negotiators are Indian,
applying for their visas.
yeah, exactly at the same time. So it's like it's completely like. Yeah, it's completely crazy. I mean, I remember people like Liam Fox were saying this is going to be easy by in 2 years' time we would have a full trade deal with the EU, and then it'd be easy. It was just copy and paste all the others on the whole colonial link thing. I did read something. I think it was maybe one of the Times or something saying like. Really tapping into that whole like colonial nostalgia. I think they said something like because they don't see the EU relationship as a partnership. They see the EU, the UK as having been dominated by the EU. So the whole thing was like we're like this great country. We used to run half the world not long ago. So surely we can govern ourselves. We don't need Brussels to govern us, which is a bit of a strange thinking because like it also makes you think like, do they really think the Germans and the Dutch and everybody else feel like they don't want to govern themselves.
The language and colonial discourse around the whole thing has been fascinating. As people saying, as you said, one stage we ran 20%, 25% of the world's land mass through empire, and you just want to say, yes, but that whole economic and psychological relationship was based on domination and in some cases slavery, really. So of course you're going to get cheap prices for the colony when you have enslaved or indentured labor. Just a longing to go back to that. And then there was an infamous comment a few months ago, where a Tory politician said that the Irish were creating difficulty with Brexit and the Irish should know their place. I mean, we've been singing the praises of the EU and certainly to me it's quite an impressive economic bloc, but it's not without its problems. The EU's been accused of being extremely inflexible around certain industries. Fishing is one of them, but I won't get into that. But South Africa itself has actually had some problems with the EU, specifically around the issue of oranges, which I am quite interested in because I've just come away from living in the Eastern Cape for several years, not far from Fort Beaufort and Alice and other places which are large orange growing districts. And the orange farmers in the Eastern Cape and throughout South Africa have been locked into quite a profound dispute with the European Union for very many years now, with the EU saying that they decline to take South African oranges because they say that they have something called black spot on them, which is a fungal disease. Something that South African farmers have vigorously denied. They sort of say there are occasional cases of it, and even then, if you do have black spot, it's not really such a big deal. And science backs our farmers. They're actually factually correct. But the accusation is that the EU has been using what is ostensibly a health and safety concern as a trade barrier. In other words, we don't want South African oranges on the market over Spanish oranges. And I've tracked this with some interest over the last few years, and I have been astonished with just how poorly behaved the European Union has been. It's really shocking. So it's not all roses there. I mean, they can be quite difficult trading partners.
Yeah, no, I suppose on one level you could argue that's their job, protect their interests and protect the interests of their members and their constituency, which is their farmer. And then our job is to protect our own members. I mean, even if you think about, I can't remember exact details now because it was such a long time ago. When the EU signed that trade deal with South Africa, that took years to negotiate, fighting over things about naming champagne and all these kind of things. And this was happening in an era of goodwill. This was a time everybody wanted to be friends with South Africa. The EU was sort of this is a period of Mandela. It was all, and this was actually done in a spirit, even some that was done in such a spirit of ostensibly on the outside anyway, where it was all about optimism and getting South Africa back into the fold and sort of tapping into that whole Madiba magic. But even then, that was not good enough. That wasn't enough to make the thing smoothly. As far as I think it took something like 7 to 8 years. That's why the people in Britain need to understand as well. Trade deals are not, they're complicated things. They're they nitpick on the smallest things. Actually, just before I came to I came back to South Africa, I was having a chat with somebody who used to work for the UK government at the time when they were negotiating the single market. And he was telling me about how the little details they had to go into, for example, regulations on bicycles, where the spokes should be, what size they should be across, those kind of.
I thought those stories were just apocryphal, that the EU wants to regulate, how long pillows should be, but maybe it's true. And
also, there's also this thing as well, people tend to misunderstand the EU because they tend to somehow see it as separate from the governments. When people talk, there's the EU nitpicking and imposing this on governments. But then the EU didn't come out of nowhere. The EU was formed by those states. It's made up of those states. And the people who work in the EU come from those states. They each have mandates from their countries. But the way people talk about it, you think it's some kind of some force from outer space that just come and taken over.
Yes, and the word dictatorship sometimes crops up with leavers here. People say we're in a dictatorship. The EU is dictated by France and Germany. And it does raise the point, do you actually know what the word dictatorship means? Quite seriously, because we sort of play quite fast and loose with language, but to actually live in an authoritarian state is so different from the mechanisms of the EU that I sometimes wonder if people haven't actually meditated on what that is.
No, so that's a key point as well. Obviously, when you have this kind of situation, there is some kind. You're gonna have some kind of trade-off between efficiency on one level and then some bit of sovereignty on the other side, on the other hand. But then people tend to forget as well is that the EU, that the UK was part of the big it was one of the big three basically that set the rules. Nothing was ever really imposed on the UK, and I think it's pity like I don't have the documents on me, but if you look back, and I think you find very few instances where the EU or where the UK was actually overruled on any particular issues within the EU. It was actually an equal partner setting these rules. It was actually one of the founding members of the single market. Well, this is what this other one person said to me. Like, he's British and he was there when the single market was formed, and he said when he reads about people talking about the EU being like this dictatorship that imposes on Britain, he said it to me, it makes him very angry because he was there and Britain was one of the leading members of formation of the single market, and as far as he was concerned, the single market is probably Britain's biggest ever achievement. And then for him, and then to him to see it being like being spoken about in those terms and being like vilified in the popular press in Britain, he actually said it breaks his heart.
Fascinating. And then the other aspect of the European Union is, of course, immigration. So one of the great advantages or great disadvantages of being an EU member, depending on your point of view, is that it allowed freedom of movement. And that means that anyone with an EU passport could move and work and live in any other EU country without restriction. That also applies to the free movement of trade and goods and capital, etc. But let's just look at the movement of people. Britain did experience an extraordinary influx, as you say, particularly from Eastern Europe. I think objectively that's true. Because the British economy is just such a powerhouse, and particularly Poland was going through a very difficult economic moment that's now slightly better, it looks like. And a lot of the vote around Brexit was clearly around a rejection of immigration. The irony being that often places that voted to leave were places with very low actual incidence of immigration. So if you don't actually live with Polish people or Indian people or South African people, you tend to be a bit more scared of them. But now Brexit, one of the central tenets is Theresa May says it's going to bring an end to freedom of movement. This leads me back to our South Africa question. I wonder if this is good news for South Africa and Commonwealth citizens. Do you think they're going to loosen up the immigration policy and there can be more movement of skilled South Africans to and from the UK, or is that also going to be a bit of a fantasy?
I doubt that will be the case in any case. That's one of the things that the people, the instigators of Brexit, they used to run around and say. They said they were going to have a much more equal immigration policy afterwards. So it would not favor the Eastern Europe. So if you're from India or the Caribbean, you'd have the same opportunity and same rights. But in fairness, that was just a smokescreen in order to divert or to push away as a defense against accusations of racism, basically. That's what that was ever about. I mean, anybody. I don't think anybody believes that somehow they were going to have this Brexit so they could open the gates to people from some African subcontinent to come to Britain. And I mean, some people believe that, but I think that was quite naive to be fair.
So, all right, well, you shot that down.
And I think also you mentioned the whole thing about skilled. I mean, for skilled people, it was never that difficult anyway. As you can tell, they put all these these arbitrary restrictions about how much income one earns. So if you were a skilled person and you were gonna go get a skilled job in the city of London, it was not difficult to get to the UK. I mean, the issue it is more difficult if you're on a lower paid level. So you might find yourself not being able to attract nurses that you need because they earn less than the 30,000 or whatever it is.
I hear your point about if you have scarce skills or you're part of the sort of financial elite. It did seem that UK immigration was possible. Certainly here in the UK, you can't come across a lot of South African medical professionals and nurses, etc. But then there is this sort of almost a middle tier of professionals who I think would want to sort of be able to move overseas. I'm thinking about environmentalists or geologists or scientists, and that immigration has been difficult for Commonwealth and musicians. Actually, Australia and New Zealand have lodged quite a lot of their displeasure at the fact that, for example, skilled musicians have found it very difficult to come and work in British orchestras because musicians are not well paid, but they are highly skilled, etc. So, all right, but what I'm hearing from you is that all ideas that Commonwealth skilled citizens the floodgates will open and they'll suddenly be able to come and participate in the UK economy is perhaps overblown.
No, totally overblown. I mean, you've had this scandal already in Britain about the Windrush generation. People who've been in Britain for forever, many years, being kicked out and it's
deported.
Been deported and being sent to places that they don't know. it's been quite disgraceful, actually. So, I mean, the idea that that same government is suddenly going to be like saying, oh, like, we want all these dark people to come from India and South Africa and Jamaica. I think that is a bit, it's just not a realistic prospect. I mean, if anything, immigration policy in the UK is turning much more strict and much more inward looking than it ever was. And that applies to everybody. I mean, and also, like, with Brexit, who knows what will happen, even within, or what kind of Brexit you get. For example, they might, in the end, opt for a kind of Norway kind of model, which actually does mean the free movement of people still continues. So there might not be any change on that level at all. And they still have these arbitrary numbers about how much immigration they want in the country. So if they have, I can't remember the numbers. They said they wanted to get it to like tens of thousands as opposed to hundreds of thousands. So if you think about it, if there's a limit of say 100 people, and then 80 people come from Eastern Europe, then it means only 20 can come from other countries.
All right, so hold the champagne is what I'm hearing there. All right, and then my last question, and this is a little bit unfair, but what's the point of having the editor of Business Day on if you can't throw him a bit of a curveball? I mean, under Zuma, under President Zuma, South Africa's foreign policy was very orientated towards the BRICS countries, perhaps sometimes not always rationally so. And there was a distinct cooling in relations towards the West and an almost complete disinterest in America and South America. Ramaphosa seems to be interested in reinvigorating connections around the world. Do you think that South Africa's foreign policy is in good enough shape to really take advantage of Brexit to South Africa's benefit, or are we still too inward looking after the Zuma years?
I mean, it's a bit tricky, that one. I've been in terms of like a relationship with Britain specifically, I would probably say yes. I mean, like, as I mentioned before, that South Africa's relationship with Britain is a very deep one and a long-standing one. And as you mentioned, that Theresa May was here quite recently. And when I was at this function earlier today and I saw Minister Davis talk about Brexit, I got the impression that he was very much engaged, and it's on the top of the agenda. But it's true, it's different. I remember when I think I was living in the UK at the time, when I think the Minister of Finance, of Foreign Affairs at the time under the Zuma government was actually asked about Brexit, and she didn't seem to know what it was. That's how bad it got.
Lukanyo, that's not a good story.
I start to be corrected here, but I think the quote I read, she said something like, "What is this Brexit thing?" And this was a South Africa's foreign minister. I think Lindiwe Sisulu is much more informed and much more engaged than that.
Lukanyo, we're coming to the end. I've taken so much of your time. I have a last question which I ask all of my guests, which is, if our listeners are interested in Brexit and they want to learn a little bit more about that after this podcast, what are 3 resources that you'd recommend, like websites that you read, or columnists, or who's covering this really well? I mean, I
tend to read other media. I wish I had more time to read journals and things like that. But I think if you're in Britain, I think the Financial Times and the Guardian are hard to beat. I always look at those 2 every day. And The Economist, actually, they does also have good commentary on it.
We have a lot of stuff ahead of us. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know if they're going to crash out without a deal. They're going to extend Article 50. So much remains unknown at this stage. But we'll have to regroup, you and I, maybe in a couple of months once things are a little bit clearer and we can swap some more notes. But thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Jessica. I look forward to chatting to you again. I'm actually going to spend some time in Britain in the next couple of weeks, so I look forward to actually just hearing people on the ground and see what they have to say. So I don't get all my views just from the FT and the Guardian.
Yeah, good to actually be on the ground. Absolutely.
No, thank you. It was my pleasure. Thank you.
If you need a bit of a morbid chuckle after all that awfulness, I would encourage you to Google the current campaign, which has seen activists mounting billboards all around London, which shows some of the lies that the ruling party has told voters about Brexit. The billboards are just a great way of holding politicians accountable for everything they said to the British people, now that it's all a bit more clear that maybe it wasn't really 100% truthful. And as a final thought, to quote my favourite protester's poster about Britain's exit from the European Union, this is like when Geri Halliwell overestimated her viability as a solo artist and left the Spice Girls. And I think we all know how that one ended. Till next time, thanks for listening.